I wonder what you thought about some of the other stories whereby religion has actually made nature a bit of a scary and disgusting thing. In the medieval time, in medieval times there was some narrative about the forest being a very evil and dangerous place where people shouldn't go. And now, in fact, within the Abrahamic religions, there's often a much more of a tendency towards a transcendent discussion of transcendent things rather than a deep appreciation of the natural world and the beautiful things in nature.
Thank you. That's a very good question. And happily I can begin to answer it a bit more, because I'll be coming back to this in the sixth and final lecture when I look at Philip Pullman, because one of the questions here is whether nature or matter is evil. So we'll be able to look at that in more detail. But let me begin to give a reply. I think you made a very good point. And one of the issues here is the way in which we see nature, irrespective of religion or philosophy or anything. Because if you go back to Beowulf, for example, that classic Saxon poem, nature is presented as something that is frightening, that can entrap us, that overwhelms us. As we read Beowulf, it's actually quite difficult for us to think ourselves into that, because if anything, we've overwhelmed nature. And so in many ways, we preserve wilderness now, in effect, as something beautiful to refresh us. Whereas for an earlier generation, that would have been something dangerous which had to be conquered in order to enable us to survive. So there's a very interesting transition from the older feeling nature is something that will overwhelm us, that in effect, civilization is what keeps nature at bay, to the idea that now that we have industrialization, we need to preserve nature to, in effect, give us something which actually industrialization has removed from us. And it's a very interesting thing. The practice of the British going to the seaside for their holidays actually dates from the early Industrial Revolution. It was very much about reconnecting with what seemed to be a disappearing natural world. So there's a very interesting point there, and I will be talking about that more in the final lecture in the series. But there is this issue about nature being seen and understood as certain things, and then this deeper issue of the changing human relationship with nature as something which once threatened to overwhelm us is actually now something that we are threatened to overwhelm. But I'll say more about that, I promise, in the final lecture. Thank you.